Hello everyone, so in this lesson we are going to be talking about lethal alleles. Now we already talked about sex-linked traits last time, but there are some lethal alleles that are sex-linked. The goal is to be able to create a Punnett square and determine which genotypes will result in, well, let's just say it being a problem. Lethal means it can kill you. So the reason lethal alleles are lethal is because there is a mutated allele that does not properly code for a protein. So it codes for a non-functional protein, and proteins are really important for the body to do important body things. Lethal alleles can either be dominant or recessive. Of course, if they're dominant, it's a much larger problem, because you only need one allele for it to be considered lethal. You can see that here. So if F is the lethal allele, which is dominant because it's capital F, and lowercase f is a normal allele, then you can have two different types of genotypes and be affected by this sort of lethal disorder. So you can be homozygous dominant, and you would be affected. You can be heterozygous, and you would be affected. And you would be unaffected if you were homozygous recessive. Now, just know that just because it's considered dominant doesn't mean that it's prevalent in the gene pool. So just because capital F lethal allele is dominant doesn't mean that it exists very frequently in a population, because it's usually eliminated. If it's lethal, then the individual is going to be dying off, potentially before they can reproduce, which means they're not going to be passing on their lethal allele. Potentially. Again, it does depend a bit on what the disorder is and sort of at what age it can affect an individual. Now, when the lethal allele is recessive, so over here we have, lowercase f, and it's a lethal allele, capital F is a normal allele, then it will only cause death when it's homozygous recessive. And in this way, these types of lethal alleles are more common because you're more able to pass on the allele because it's recessive, so you can be a carrier and not affected. So did I introduce this term? I think so. Last lesson, I introduced the term carrier. So carrier is someone who is heterozygous with the lethal allele. So it means they're carrying the allele, but they do not phenotypically express it. So they're not affected by it, they're a carrier. They can pass it on to their children because they live long enough to reproduce. So that term carrier is really important, and it just means that they're going to be heterozygous. You'll see it pop up frequently in different questions. Here's a human example. Brachydactyly, which means, it causes your fingers to not properly develop. And when it is it is a recessive disorder, and when it's homozygous recessive, you can actually result in skeletal defects, and so it is fatal in homozygous recessive individuals. So, I may have misspoke. When it's homozygous recessive, you get complete skeletal defects. When an individual is heterozygous, they are impacted by having short fingers, but it's not fatal to them. It won't kill them, but they are going to have possibly some physical limitations as a result of that. Let's say we cross two heterozygous individuals. So B is normal and B is affected with the disorder. So if we crossed two heterozygous individuals, or two parents had children, what is the likelihood of them passing on them having a child that does not survive? What is the likelihood of that? I would encourage you to pause the video and give it a try yourself. So I'm going to create my table, put in my alleles. There's mom, there's dad, and just fill in my table. So here we have a normal child. Here we would have a heterozygous child, so that means they are going to have brachydactyly. Here is another heterozygous child, which means they are also potentially going to have brachydactyly. And here is a homozygous recessive child, which is lethal because they're going to have severe skeletal defects. And so there is a 25% chance that that they will have a child that does not survive. There is a 50% chance that they will have a child with brachydactyly, and there is a 25% chance that the child will be unaffected. So just so you can see an example of brachydactyly, so the fingers are not properly developed, but it's by no means a lethal impairment when the individual is heterozygous. Here's another human example, which is sickle cell anemia. So it's also recessive. So in the homozygous recessive state, then it is lethal. So an individual will not be able to survive. Anemia has a few things going on, but basically, in sickle cell anemia, it causes blood cells to be in the shape of a sickle. So you can see one here. It's sort of flat and rounded as opposed to the circular shape that you might be used to seeing. And this causes the blood cell to not be able to carry oxygen to your cells. And of course, we need oxygen. So if you're not getting enough, then it's going to be lethal. Now, in this case, sickle cell anemia is actually codominant. So in the heterozygous state, you're going to get some cells that are normal and some cells that are sickle cells. So you're going to be seeing the expression of both of them because normal and sickle cell are codominant. Interestingly enough, in areas where malaria is prevalent, to be heterozygous is actually a benefit to that individual because they were able to sort of prevent the spread of malaria because it means that mosquitoes can't breed as easily in their blood. Sorry, it's not the mosquitoes breeding, it's the Plasmodium protist that would be breeding in the blood, and they're not able to do that. And so being a heterozygous carrier in areas where malaria is prevalent is actually a positive thing. And to be homozygous recessive, there is a 50% chance of death by age, though just know that it does depend a little bit on where you are and sort of your access to healthcare. Now, there are a few issues with sickle cell anemia, and one of them is that they don't carry oxygen as well. Another is that they don't live as long as red blood cells, so it results in fewer red blood cells, so again, not carrying oxygen. And then they can also actually create blood flow blockages, which again means you're not getting oxygen to their cells, which is a problem. If you are heterozygous for the trait, so that means you have some sickle cells and some normal cells, then generally that person will not have any symptoms, and they're going to live a normal life, and they're going to potentially pass on that allele to their children. Here's another example. Tay-Sachs disease is lethal in the homozygous recessive state by age 4. It's something that results in brain deterioration. If we skip through, cystic fibrosis may be a disease that you're familiar with, And once again, it's lethal in the homozygous recessive trait. Like I mentioned before, recessive lethal alleles are more common because usually dominant ones die out of a population before they're able to reproduce and pass on that allele. Cystic fibrosis, the life expectancy is around 30 years potentially, or less than 30 years I should say, but in that time an individual can reproduce and pass on their alleles, even if they're homozygous recessive. Cystic fibrosis is the most common lethal allele in the US. There was a book/movie made where the main characters had cystic fibrosis. I can't quite remember it. I know that it was made by one of the Green brothers. Okay, that's it for lethal alleles lesson. What you should be able to do is draw some Punnett squares using examples of lethal alleles and be able to predict the offspring for them. As always, if you have any questions, let me know, and good luck.